Ping. We're excited to have you join us today. I do hope you'll find this session informative and engaging. It is a really important subject to me and to us collectively as a group. If you've got any further questions, please ask through the chat or the Q&A. And now let's get started. So the first person I'd like to ask to speak is Brian Lipinski, a colleague and friend of mine from WRI, who knows a huge amount about food loss and waste, the global significance of the issue, and he's going to give us a bit of a context. So over to you, Brian.
Thank you so much, Liz. I'm just going to set the stage for us today. I know we probably have a wide range of expertise on food loss and waste on the call today, on this webinar. So for some of you, you're very familiar with this information. For others, hopefully this will help you to understand why we think this issue is so important and why we believe that food loss and waste should be a part of every country's NDC. So at the highest level, about 1/3 of all food produced in the world is lost or wasted, excuse me, at some point in the food supply chain. This is actually a conservative estimate even. More recent data suggests that maybe it's closer to 40%. So regardless, it's quite high. And I see a question in the chat already saying, aren't there higher estimates? Yes, there are some higher estimates that have come out more recently. These are just conservative figures. So about $940 billion each year for the global economy, and between 8 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So on the next slide, we'll see that, again, this is using that slightly more conservative 8% estimate. But regardless, if you were to put all of the world's food loss and waste into one country, it would be the world's 3rd largest greenhouse gas emitter. So this is a really significant contributor to greenhouse gases globally. And yet it still is something of an underexplored climate solution in terms of how food loss and waste reduction can help countries meet their greenhouse gas reduction targets and how we can dull the impacts of climate change. So looking again at the next slide, what we're looking at here is an estimate of what types of food are wasted globally based on commodity type. However, what I'd like to point out here is that this is based on weight. And so this is how these data points are often presented, is in terms of weight. And so you'll see, if you look at it based on weight, you're seeing that cereals, roots and tubers, and fruits and vegetables are the largest contributors to food loss and waste. But many of these items, especially fruits and vegetables, have high water content, which is why they have a higher weight. Whereas when you look at things like meat and milk, which are relatively small percentages of this loss and waste by weight figure, you might get the sense that those items aren't as important for addressing climate change, for addressing food loss and waste. But from a climate perspective, they're actually hugely important because of the disproportionate impacts, the disproportionate climate impacts associated with meat and dairy production. So this is a way of showing that even though when we look at things one way, by weight, we might get a sense that the problem lies with certain commodity types. If you look at the climate impacts, you'll get a different picture when it comes to things like meat and dairy, especially. Similarly, it used to be a common perception when we would talk about food loss and waste globally, was that in higher income countries, you would see more waste happening towards the end of the supply chain, at the consumer level and at the restaurant and food service and retail levels. Whereas you would see in lower income countries that were perhaps more agricultural in nature, you would see more loss happening closer to the farm level. And while there's still some evidence that that's where focus should take place, a lot of more recent evidence suggests that food waste is happening all over the world. Consumer food waste is happening in high-income countries, medium-income countries, and low-income countries. So really, all countries need to be focusing on both food loss and food waste. So taking a look at the next slide, we're seeing a lot of awareness growing in public consciousness about the connection between food loss and waste and climate change. So these are just some recent headlines that I found about how food waste is contributing to climate change. There's a growing perception here that these issues are intrinsically linked. And of course, one of the biggest news stories we've experienced in the food loss and waste world recently is the new proposal from the EU Commission aiming for the 30% cut in EU food waste by 2030. So there's a gap here between the understanding that food waste is indeed a huge contributor to climate change, and yet we don't see that link happening as much in policy, especially when it comes to things like the NDCs. And so taking a look at the next slide here, I think most of us on the call are probably familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, and specifically Sustainable Development Goal Target 12.3. This aims to have per capita global food waste at the retail and consumer levels, as well as reducing food losses throughout the entire supply chain. The reason I want to call this attention to this is because all United Nations member countries have already agreed to this target in principle. So I think the logical extension is that this target should be reflected in the NDCs. And so I'd like to use that as a little bit of a framing idea that this target should be guiding activity in the NDCs. We need to be strengthening this link between climate and food waste. And so I'm going to leave it to my colleagues for the remainder of our conversation to get into the more specifics about how it can be incorporated into the NDCs and what countries are already doing this well. But hopefully this helps set the stage for just giving everyone a little bit of background of the importance of this issue and why we're focusing on it today. So thank you so much for being here.
Great, thank you, Brian. Thanks very much. And I can see that we've already got a question in the box. I'll leave it to answer that question until we hear from the other speakers, and then we'll come back to that. So now I'd like to turn to Jamie from the NDC Partnership, who's going to talk a bit more about the work they've been doing on. There's an extra slide there. Why don't I carry on? So the benefits. I mean, this just summarises the benefits. You know, the social benefits of improving food security, the environmental benefits, protecting resources and reducing climate change, and the economic benefits, sort of removing unnecessary costs, increasing efficiency, and generating new revenue sources for farmers and for others in society. Next slide. There you go. So now it is going to be Jamie to talk about the work that they've been doing in the NDC Partnership to help member states to develop their NDCs and the support that's available to help include food loss and waste reduction in your NDCs. Jamie.
Thank you, Liz. As was mentioned, my name is Jamie Bindon. I'm an NDC enhancement knowledge specialist with the NDC Partnership. And in the next slide, I'll take a moment to go over what the NDC Partnership is. So next slide, please. The NDC Partnership is a global coalition. We bring together more than 200 members, including more than 120 countries, both developed and developing, and more than 80 institutions to deliver on ambitious climate action that helps to achieve the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, like Brian just mentioned. To provide an overview of how we work, governments identify their NDC implementation priorities and the type of support needed to translate them into actionable policies and programs. So looking at this, if food loss and waste is an implementation priority, countries would identify the type of support needed to achieve that food loss and food waste reduction, and then request support to the partnership. Then based on those requests, the membership offers a tailored package of expertise, technical assistance, and funding to support those requests. The collaborative response of this model provides developing countries with efficient access to a wide range of resources to adapt to and mitigate climate change, as well as foster more equitable and sustainable development. Essentially, the partnership is built on the premise that by acting together, we can achieve more. And countries are able to, through the partnership, draw on member expertise and funding, turning their NDCs into actionable policies, programs, projects, etc. So we really have an approach that powers collective response where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Next slide, please. And part of that work has involved our climate action enhancement package, which was launched in 2019 as a dedicated support offering for countries looking to update and enhance their NDCs. So through CAP, the partnership mobilized more than $55 million to support 67 developing countries around the globe in enhancing and fast tracking the implementation of their NDCs. So I'll take a bit of time today to go over what some of that support looked like, but with an eye to the various sectors and the work related to food loss and food waste reduction. But we published a report on global trends and lessons learned from CAP that has more details across the different sectors, across the NDC quality, the ambition, and the process by which countries develop their NDCs. And I would encourage you to visit our website and read the report. You can do that by scanning the QR code with your phone or visiting enhancement.ndcpartnership.org. So the results from this support and the NDCs submitted to the UNFCCC were much more robust than the first generation of NDCs on both mitigation and adaptation issues. And we see through stronger underlying data, countries' new NDCs are more detailed, achievable, and verifiable. So in the next slide, we look at the different components that have gone into strong NDCs. And next slide, please. We can see that the NDC enhancement components are multifaceted. When we carried out this analysis, what really came out strongly was that improvements in NDC quality, as well as the process by which countries followed to carry out the development of their new NDCs, were critical enabling components to effectively ratchet up ambition. And I'll go into some examples of how this relates to food loss and food waste reduction in a second. But the specific work that was done to do outreach to vulnerable groups or ensure that baseline targets were accurate was really helpful in further enabling those NDCs. And the next slide, I want to take a look at all of the different sectoral requests that the partnership receives and have this broken up by region. So this is going beyond CAP, but to all requests that we receive in terms of partnership plans, requests for support letters, the climate action enhancement package. And we can see that the breakdown of requests varies by region. Agriculture accounts for a total of 855 requests, while waste accounts for 421. We can see, for example, that in the Middle East and North Africa, where the highest proportion of requests related to waste are in that region, while Europe and Central Asia have the highest proportion of requests related to agriculture. Next slide, please. And something that we saw in CAP is an expanded coverage of sectors and gases in countries' NDCs. By including these specific sectors, by looking at agriculture, by looking at waste, enhanced targets with specific GHG targets are useful tools in countries' revised NDCs because they allow for more granular and realistic planning. While a lot of countries have enhanced sectoral coverage of both agriculture and waste, few explicitly name food loss and waste, which is an important component of ensuring that specific targets are achievable in the food loss and waste arena. There are a couple different examples of where we've seen countries expand their NDCs and receive CAP support on this work. So for example, Colombia delivered a really inclusive NDC update process by rolling out a significant stakeholder engagement plan to consult and validate its NDC targets. And through both inclusive stakeholder processes, as well as really robust quality of the NDC data, the adaptation strategy of the country was expanded from 9 to 27 commitments, which spans themes of food security, water security, biodiversity, health, and infrastructure. And these were identified as highly vulnerable to climate change based on comprehensive risk assessment frameworks developed for the NDC. So by bringing in grassroots communities and institutions and encouraging their participation in the NDC update, Colombia was able to bring in Indigenous and Afro-descendant populations who play a fundamental role in the protection and sustainable use of forests, and similarly rural communities who are essential to safeguarding the country's food security. So the inclusive stakeholder process allowed for concerns of vulnerable groups to be heard, considered, and addressed when designing the NDC targets. Another interesting example that we have of a country requesting support on food loss is looking at Belize, who is requesting support to reduce post-harvest losses. So this has included requests for support in research partnerships, the development of a financing facility to support this work, which has been supported by the World Bank, and support for distribution of drought-tolerant seeds. They've also requested support for improved resilience in the agricultural sector with activities including the development of awareness programs with specific outreach to farmers, women, and young people to raise awareness. They're also looking at development of land use and policy frameworks, which can help to support communities where flooding of agricultural land may be a risk. Cambodia received support under CAP for the development of horticulture support and looking at how food crops can increase production, improve quality, safety, and improved harvesting and post-harvesting techniques within the agro-business. In the next slide, we'll look ahead at the next round of NDC updates. With the next round of updates, we know that raising global climate ambition is going to require aligning LT-LEDs with NDCs. So to support countries in this effort, the partnership launched in November the thematic call on LT-LEDs, which looks at the two interconnected fronts of preparing, updating, and refining long-term low-emission development strategies and enhancing the quality and increasing the ambition of NDCs. So the aim of this support offering is to advance both of these tools while fostering alignment between the two instruments and developing capacities for their sustained implementation. So the main goal is to facilitate and leverage support for the transition towards climate compatible development. And we're already seeing countries request support related to food loss and waste under the thematic call. And this is also a support offering where countries can seek support to include food loss and waste in their NDCs. Benin and Honduras are seeking support to update GHG inventories in critical sectors, including AFOLU and waste. LAOPR has requested support aimed to assess the country's capacity and governance mechanisms to improve and strengthen national policy across sectors, including agriculture. And Morocco is requesting support to carry out a multi-stakeholder study on energy consumption of different economic sectors, including agriculture. So we're already seeing some windows of entry into this work and some exciting opportunities for countries in enhancing their NDCs to include food loss and waste, and to have those robust processes by which they're consulting different stakeholders and the robust quality and data to go behind the NDC targets. So really exciting work ahead, and I'm excited to hear more from Martina, our next presenter, on the work that countries have been doing in their NDCs on food loss and waste. But I'm happy to answer any questions as we get to the discussion later. And Liz, back over to you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Really interesting and fascinating, the wide range of questions you get. You must sort of dread opening your email sometimes to wonder what the question is going to be. But anyway, moving on to our next speaker, who is Martina Fleckenstein, who's the Global Policy Director Food with WWF. Martina, I think you're going to tell us about some of your work and your examples of countries you've been working with.
I'm unmuted. Thanks, Liz, and thanks for the kind introduction. Could you go to my PowerPoint presentation, please? I would like to talk about the food loss and waste in the NDCs. And the next slide, please. The challenge is, and that's it, why WWF and partners, we want to see a stronger focus on food systems in the NDCs. And 30%, and we know this, of all the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from food production. And this is from the production, it's food loss and waste, and it's diet. And based on this study, there is 80% of the mitigation opportunities are linked to food system. And next slide, and this is why we really want, and I appreciate to have this webinar here, is to strengthen the integration of food systems in the NDC. And what you see here is the reduction potential. And could you click again this on the slide, please? Next slide. Oh, there is something missing, but okay. And what we have done is for the COP27, we have done an assessment of all NDCs to see if there is any changes on the updated NDCs in context with food system measures. And the good thing is, and that's the positive thing of this analysis, that there is an increase of 60% of all the updated NDCs have integrated somehow food system measures in the new and updated NDCs. So that means that about 93% of all NDCs have somehow are tackling food systems. The big problem is, and this is still all over, is that we have an implementation gap. And therefore, it's really good to see the work from the NDC Partnership to strengthening the NDC implementation. Next slide, please. In the results we had from this analysis, and that's also really encouraging, is that 94 of the updated NDCs have really included mitigation measures for agriculture, which is nearly doubling to the previous NDCs in the previous years. We also are very positive is that agroecology is mentioned, and agroforestry also has not doubled, but it's from 94 to 70 of the NDCs, which are mentioning now agroforestry. And this is just a snapshot. Next slide, please. We also have considered more in detail what has happened with food loss and waste and post-harvest losses. In the updated NDCs, post-harvest losses are more considered compared to the previous one. And it's the same to food loss and waste. 90 of the updated NDCs are now mentioning food loss and waste. And we have summarized, or we have given here are the countries which are mentioning food loss and waste in their NDCs. If you want to learn more about this, have a look on our webpage where you find first the report which we have done in 2020 and the NDC assessment from last year, which have prepared for the COP27. Next slide, please. The measures which are mentioned, and that's also interesting, and these are just two country examples on food waste. One is China. In China, we are also running a project together with FREYR on a campaign on reducing of food waste in the hospitality sector. China has run a campaign some years back, the Empty Plate Public Awareness Campaign, and they also have this example, if you take food and you don't eat it, you have to pay a kind of fee. Some restaurants are doing this still in China. And the second country we have pointed out, and this is especially because the COP28 will happen in United Arab Emirates, they have a huge campaign to reduce food loss and waste. They have started this some years back, and they call it now the Food Waste Pledge. So there is also a very nice webpage, and it's a huge campaign at the moment running in the United Arab Emirates. Just two examples of a number of these 90 countries. Next slide, please. And on the post-harvest loss, which is always a huge portion on generating greenhouse gas emission, there are a lot of number of examples, and these are just some examples, like Malawi, who really are working on including storage and post-harvest storages. They have developed a new technology. In Vietnam, they really work on an improved information system for managing fishing waste. Cambodia is improving their infrastructure. And the example of Chile was already mentioned, who have developed a circular economy roadmap to be implemented over the next 20 years. So in post-harvest loss, it's all about this food storage, processing, it's about circular economy, it's about organic management, waste management, and compost. Next slide, please. Having said this, we are still on a long way forward. So like I mentioned, even there are 93% of all the NDCs are mentioning somehow measures on food system, but it's not a really systemic approach. And very often there is a gap in knowledge in the member states how they could implement NDCs for food systems. And this is from the production, food loss and waste, post-harvest loss, and especially consumption and diets. And in this context, we are currently working on a tool for policymakers and practitioners with very concrete measures, identifying mitigation options, adaptation options, the co-benefit, and also identifying the cost to implement the measures. This tool is a joint project with Climate Focus and partners, and will be launched in Dubai at the COP28. It will also be not only be on the paper, but we want to put this in an interactive, accessible and simply website, so that like a decision tree, so that countries really could see and decide on which are the right approaches, the right measures in their country, because it will always be different measures in the different parts, in the different regions of the world. And we're also considering this tool maybe to extend to other areas, maybe energy and transport, to really make this all applicable and practicable. The next slide, and this is a little bit on the recommendations, and NGOs always have recommendations. So what we want to see in this food system approach in NDCs, but also this is also tackling all the other UN conventions. So this is also important for the biodiversity, global biodiversity framework, and for the land convention. We need to have a global shift to a nature positive system, reduction food loss and waste and post-harvest losses, transition to healthy diets, and we have to work in different levels together and to better align all these approaches. And there is one final slide, please. And this is on what we need to do at the national level. So all this has to be developed in a collaborative way with the partners on the ground, not a top-down approach, inclusion of agroecology at one of the entry points for nature positive production. We need to strengthen the post-harvest loss and the food waste measures, engage with the smallholders, And finally, really have quantified measurable targets, and we need milestones. And just to reiterate to the speaker of the first presentation, we really have to align all these activities also with the SDG. And in this context is SDG 12.3, what you have heard. So these are the things we really have to work towards. The time is now. We can't wait any longer. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. That's really fascinating. And I think it's interesting that both Jamie and Martina have demonstrated the pitifully small number of countries that have currently got food loss and waste in their NDCs. Move on to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to finish off the input part of this webinar with a couple of slides just on the importance of including food loss and waste in your NDCs. We had thought when we first started planning this webinar that we would ask a country to come along who has included it and to talk about their experience and the best practice and what works and what doesn't. But actually, because there are so few countries actually doing that, that became quite difficult. So this is putting on some work done by UNDP and WRI, that it's been going through the NDCs to actually understand what wording might work. So basically just mentioning food loss and waste in the first place is great. And specifically mentioning reducing food loss, reducing food waste, increasing recycling. Those are all great as a starting point. But then if you can identify specific actions that support that aim. So, for example, picking out a country, food waste recycling in Dominica needs public raising awareness campaign and an extension program. So just talking about some of the specific actions that need to happen to help reduce the food loss and waste. And maybe even referring to supplementary documents that you might already have, or that you're going to develop, strategies, programs, initiatives, and then setting specific targets. So setting targets which might be a direct reference to SDG 12.3, which obviously would be fantastic, but it might be that you're going to aim to reach a specific number of farmers, or to reach a specific number of consumers, and to influence them to actually do something different. So there's a whole range of things that you could do to just drop it into your NDCs. And any improvement from where we are at the moment would be great. And then my next slide, which is the last slide, is really just to remember that there are lots of people out there who can help. So you've already heard from Jamie, and there is clearly a massive resource of expertise and support that you can tap into through the NDC partnership, and I'm sure they can point you on to other people. You can come to us at WRI, and my email address and Brian's email address are on that slide, or to the wider Champions group, and Brian and I can easily put you in touch with others in the Champions group. So that's the end of our input. I think the important thing to come through is, food loss and waste is an important issue. It does make it does have a big influence on greenhouse gas emissions. It is responsible for a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. We've all got massive targets to achieve, so we need to do something about food loss and waste as part of that exercise. And there have been quite a few studies that suggest that we're not going to reach the Paris Agreement targets without tackling food loss and waste. So I can see that there have been a number of questions, and I'm now going to hand back to Jamie, who's going to moderate the Q&A for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. I just want to say a huge thank you to all of the presenters today. This series of webinars, the Raising Ambition Through Partnership series, wouldn't be possible without all of the partnership that we have amongst our members and our colleagues. So I'm excited to have all of you working on this topic and with us today. We've gotten a few questions in the chat, and so I'm excited to ask you, Liz, Martina, Brian, some of these questions, and then where relevant, come in with some perspective from the partnership as well. But I think I might start with a question that looks at the actual GHG emissions. How can countries or actors estimate or measure the GHG emissions avoided through reducing food loss and waste? If a country doesn't have any data on food loss and food waste reduction, how can they move forward to include that in their NDC? How do they know what the impact might be within their particular country?
So maybe I'll make a start on that, and Brian and Martina can come in. I mean, I think the first thing is to look at what data you have as a country, and to start to make some estimates. All countries have an issue, have food loss and waste, so there's nowhere that can say they don't have it and therefore it shouldn't be in their NDCs. We should have it. We should have food loss and waste mentioned in every single NDC that's being generated. But I think if you don't have the data, and many countries don't, then you just need to, maybe your initial commitment is to start to get the data so that you can then set targets. Some countries do have some data. So for example, they may have their waste figures, and then they can make some estimate as to what percentage of their waste figures is actually food related. And then others will have specific studies that have been done on particular types of waste. So they may have some food with some household data, or they may have something about a particular crop. So I think it's by building those pictures, but to actually just mention it in your NDC, and then to maybe set the commitment to measuring it, or to set the commitment to trying to understand hotspots. I know in the UK, when we were first starting, we started by having some brainstorms among the people who might have some pieces of the jigsaw, get them together and share that information and come up with a plan for how you're going to build that picture and establish a baseline, even if it's an estimated baseline. It has to be better than nothing. I don't know, Martina, if you've got anything to add to that.
No, that's a perfect answer. I only could add, in the studies we have done and the recommendation, this is more an average and estimated figure. So at the end, the measure have to be on the ground, and I think it's still a huge gap on getting all these figures from countries. Some countries are more advanced and some are less advanced, and so it's still a challenge to get really the concrete greenhouse gas emission targets. So that's a little bit from our learning. I think it's easier on the food waste and less easy on the post-harvest losses. So that's from our experience, and I see Jamie is nodding, so maybe you have also an answer on that.
I would also just note that that's, I think, where we're seeing more requests from countries is on that same dynamic. So I think that may speak also to your point that there are more challenges compared to others. One of the questions that we had in the Q&A relates to if there are any tools or resources that we might point participants to in terms of methane abatement, for example, for food loss and waste reduction. Any thoughts or ideas of where someone might start to go and look for tools or resources?
I know there is some work being done to look at a tool to look at methane associated with food loss and waste. WRI has done some work to look at the greenhouse gas emissions more generally on food waste. Brian, I don't know if you can speak to that, but I know neither of us were directly involved in the piece of work.
Yeah, there are a few tools that can help you get to some related data. Unfortunately, nothing is a perfect fit. There's a number of tools available on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol website. There's also a tool called the Cool Food Tool, which is a calculator that is not specifically designed for food loss and waste. It's actually for understanding the climate impacts associated with food production in a certain type of dish, for example, but it can still provide some of the necessary factors that might help for an estimate. And also the EPA WARM tool is a useful tool for understanding the associated emissions with a variety of different destinations. So where food loss and waste goes when it leaves the food supply chain. So unfortunately, there's no one-stop tool just yet, but there are a number of tools that will help you get there. At least not that I'm aware of, but also we have a number of very informed people in the chat. So I'm sure if there's anything that anyone wants to promote as a possible resource here, I think that would be great as well.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I completely agree that if you have resources that you would want to point attendees to, or particular examples, please do share those in the chat. This is certainly a learning community. A question for Martina. In looking at NDCs and food loss and waste, out of the countries that do have food systems in their NDCs or have updated to include food loss and waste in the NDCs, do they have financing linked to these? And is this a critical component in looking at including this in their NDC?
Yes, I think finance is always a critical thing, because all these things have to be financed, and even a lot is going on maybe on the innovation part. But I think that's exactly what the NDC partnership, I understood, is getting in. If there is a need for implementation of one of these measures, they could reach out, and Jamie, correct me if I'm wrong, and ask for co-financing of measures. So yes, it's always a question of how to finance it in general for all the NDC implementation activities. And that's why we also want to put in our tool also at least the average figures, so that member states or countries get an idea what the investment is to implement the one or the other measure, not only on food loss and waste, but also on nature positive production and on the consumption part. But maybe Jamie, you have also an answer or something to add on that.
Yeah, thanks, Martina. Actually, I was going to come in. We have, through the NDC partnership, we have a NDC investment planning guide and checklist that is meant to provide countries with step-by-step guidance to develop and strengthen their climate commitments into action by developing climate investment plans based on current best practices from what we have seen across the partnership. So it's something that countries can use. It's not meant to be a template, but rather guidance that can be tailored to their particular country context, their unique fiscal circumstances, as well as the different goals and their climate ambition. So we know that the process of investment planning can be extensive, and the scope of planning can vary depending on the commitment and the actions necessary to carry it out. But I would suggest that countries that are interested in looking at costing, at financing, start there. And I can say certainly we have seen requests for support through the partnership and looking at finance on some of these components. I believe that I highlighted an example earlier, which looked at a financing facility to support resilient agriculture, so that some of these projects and components could be carried out effectively. And that was supported by the World Bank in Belize, which is a country that did include food loss and food waste in their NDC. But certainly the kind of support that the partnership also looks to provide. I'm going to put the link to the investment planning toolkit in the chat, but you can find it also on our website and can share it in the follow-up as well, if that's helpful. Liz, I saw you come off mute. Did you want to add in on this question?
No, I was fine. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay. So this is an interesting question in looking at reduction of food waste and consumption in one country can mean reduction of greenhouse gas from food or feed production in other countries. Is there a possibility that that could lead to double counting of avoided GHG emissions?
I think that is a concern, and it's one that lots of people have. And I think it's an unresolved problem, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to count. Let's just be very clear about what you're counting and where it's, the different sources, and therefore we've at least gathered the data, and we can then try to make sure there isn't some double counting in there. But it is a problem. Yeah,
I think it's an excellent question, and definitely something for countries to consider, and where they're looking at their data and what is coming out of those. So thank you for that question. One One question that's looking up, I think, a bit at a reaction of the EU Commission and the binding target of reducing by 30% through 2030. What are your reactions to this? The question specifically asks whether this can undermine the efforts of reaching the 50% reduction target of SDG 12.3, but curious your overall thoughts on this commitment.
I'll go first because I feel quite strongly about this. I think that they should be congratulated for setting a target. It's a legally binding target. It's the first group of countries to have set a legally binding target. So there are real consequences for the member states if they don't achieve the 30% reduction. And I know that the Commission themselves see it as a way of providing impetus to make progress start to happen. There are an awful lot of countries sitting out there who are not actively trying to reduce food loss and waste and haven't prioritised it sufficiently. And the EU, by their action, is making sure that it will be prioritised. Just as an aside, we also know that even getting 30% will be quite difficult. So they've set themselves a very challenging deadline, especially as we're only 7 years away from 2030. So yes, I know that some people will be concerned it's not 50%, and I'm sure the Commission would have liked to set 50% because I know they are fully behind the SDG. But as it's legally binding, I think it was a pragmatic solution to come to.
Thanks, Liz. Very, very interesting reaction. Brian or Martina, anything to add there?
No, I think it's really interesting, and I think we have to see that the SDGs are voluntary, the NDCs are mandatory. Yeah, so therefore bringing together these two targets, I think this is even more important. And considering if the EU with a 30% of a binding target, it's really interesting to consider also how the measuring, the monitoring will happening, and if this could be a kind of blueprint for other parts of the world. Yeah, so therefore it could be very strong. And I get always a little bit nervous because yes, we have only 7 years and we want to reduce food loss and waste and post-harvest losses by 50%. It's voluntary, and maybe a 30% binding target will accelerating this process a little bit more, because all these targets and the implementation are still much too slow to tackle all the problems we have. And if we want really to reduce the greenhouse gas and achieve a 1.5 target, we have to accelerate the process more. So let's see how it will work out. And but at the same time, don't lose the 50% targets, voluntary still, but in the other parts of the world.
Thanks, Martina. I think my mind in hearing both of your responses goes to the process of NDCs and ratcheting up ambition, and I wonder whether that's prevalent here as well. I want to go to a question with Martina, you raising the NDCs and the mandatory component of them. I'm curious, for looking at food loss and waste for countries that are considering this in their NDC, when looking across ministries, the people who are writing the NDC are not necessarily the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of Environment. If a country, if someone in the Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Agriculture is seeing the value of including food loss and waste in their NDC, but know that they may not be necessarily the ones writing the document itself, what can they do? What approaches might you recommend?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. So it's easy to say we have to align the Rio Conventions, the biodiversity, the land, and the climate one. But the reality on the ground is still far away. And we had recently a discussion, and somebody mentioned to tackle the problem, we also need institutional innovation. So, and that's the big challenge, yeah. And that's something where governments have to think about if they really take these conventions and the SDG serious, yeah. We have to see, and I think this is really, we have to see how we could align this better. And like what you mentioned is very often it's an environmental ministry, maybe it's a development ministry, it's an agriculture and a health ministry, and they even don't talk to each other. So, and this is a challenge. And if there are good examples, and we are still looking for these good examples on the ground at member state level to really promote this and say, hey, things could work, we would be really happy to know more about this, yeah, because I think this is a problem we haven't solved. And there needs really to be more innovation, creativity, and alignment at a very low level at the very end. Yeah. So hammering the topic, reiterating, and hopefully there will be slightly changes in the future on this.
Thanks, Martina. Liz, I saw you come off of mute. I'd like to hear your reaction as well.
Yeah, the first time around it was a bit of just slipped finger, but this it was deliberate. No, I mean, I think I completely agree with Martina. I mean, you know, we need some institutional changes to allow this cross-departmental work to work better, because, you know, climate change affects us all, and it applies to every single ministry in a government. At the very basic level, you just need the important people to get together and actually talk about it, to come up with a shared objective, and then they can each individually go away and implement it in their own ministries. But there has to be more cross-ministerial working. And you know, I can see that there's a comment in the chat already about the fact that there is more communication between ministries that needs to happen. So yeah, completely agree with that.
Thank you both. I think this is something that through the NDC partnership and our model, we have focal points in both the ministries of environment as well as the ministries of finance, development, planning, whatever the particular ministry is in that country. And so by having that engagement across both of these really important ministries when it comes to aligning the climate and development agenda, that does, we do aim to sort of address that issue head on, but it is still a challenge because the ministries have such large portfolios of work that they're engaged in, that cross collaboration can be difficult. But I think certainly finding those entry points is really, really important. We only have a few minutes left, so I will just ask if you have any closing thoughts, anything that burning, pressing reactions that you want to make sure you share with our participants before we close. Maybe I'll start first with you, Martina. Any final thoughts, any main takeaway you think our audience should leave with today?
No, first of all, thanks for having this webinar. I think it's always good to really discuss how we could strengthen food loss and waste, not only in the NDCs, but also for the fulfillment of 12.3. And the more we talk and the more we try to really generate action on the ground, and we really have to fulfill this implementation gap, the better. So thanks a lot. And really, I think in this case also, it's a question of innovation. So we need more innovation on this. Sometimes it's not super expensive. It could be the small things really to make changes, and that's something we really have to remind every day when we eat or when we go out, and also to really share lessons learned and do this kind of knowledge exchange, what we have done here. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Brian, I'll go over to you. Any last thoughts, closing musings?
I guess sort of a refrain that I've been noticing as we've all been talking and hearing other presentations is that there's a lot of this that's going to be learning by doing. And so we just need to start. We can't wait until we have the perfect tools and the perfect, you know, scope 3 emissions tracking and all of this. These are all important. These are all things that hopefully will come as we start working on it more. But I think we need more activity happening, and then some of those tools will come out as a response to that, where we'll say, oh, we need these tools now, so we'll start developing them more. So I think it's a bit of a virtuous cycle, hopefully, if we just start focusing on this a bit more and getting the wheels rolling.
Thanks, Brian. We need more of those virtuous cycles. I think that's a great thought. Liz, I'd like to hand you to close us out, your final reflections and anything that we should take away from this session.
Thank you very much, Jamie, and thank you for being part of sharing the organising of this webinar. I guess I'm just, struck by the level of commitments, among the speakers, but also by all of you and the comments that I've been seeing. There have been some great resources shared as well, so make sure that you capture some of those. So there is a huge level of commitment out there to do more on food loss and waste. We've just got to translate it into real action. We're only 7 years away, and there is clearly not enough happening around the world yet on food loss and waste. We have to get it up the agenda and have to make sure that we move forward, even though, as Brian says, we haven't got the perfect answers to everything, and it's not that easy. There are lots of easy things we can do. So let's get on and start to make a difference. But thank you very much to everybody for joining, and thank you for all this background support as well within the NDC partnership and moving the slides and all the translators. So really appreciate all your time, and hope you found it useful. And I know the slides and the recording will be available afterwards. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.